Hello everyone, and welcome to our week 3 video. We talked about American government as sort of the game of American government, where we have the game, the rules, the goals, the players. This week we're mostly going to be talking about the goals and the players. Now, the goals of American government. This is a fairly broad question. What are the goals of our government? Why do we have this government? What do we want to get out of the government? What do we want the government to do for us? And there are a million things you could throw out as possible goals. But let's talk about some general things that are fairly fundamental in a democratic republic. First of all, we do have some shared core values, those that are held by most people in this country. And, these include things like individual liberty. Of course, we all want to have our freedoms and basically not be hassled and not be forced to do essentially everything that somebody else tells us. Okay. And we want some sense of political equality so that, we want to be able to participate in the government as much as anybody else would or could. We generally in this country like the idea of majority rule. If 90% of the people think we should do one thing, we should probably do that as opposed to follow what the other 10% want. We generally in this country have a fairly strong support for civil rights as a goal of American government. Now, keep in mind that may or may not have been one of the goals of the founders when they wrote the Constitution. It was a document that, by its very nature, expressly was not creating an equal society among all the members of the people, or at least among the people who lived in this country. And we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. And we also generally, as a people, agree that there should be some degree of economic freedom. We get to do the types of job we want if we're able to do it. We don't have the government telling us, no, from the time you're born, you're going to go up and you're going to go off and be a doctor. You're going to go be a welder. You're going to be, an accountant. And, if you want to start your own business and maybe have a little profit from that, or you want to take a job that pays more than another job. These are things that we generally agree are good things. But it's never that easy because there's a tension. Even these broad goals that we say, if you say, hey, do you like the idea of individual liberty? Most people are going to say, yes, I like the idea of individual liberty. Do you like the idea of majority? Yes. But there's tension because, if you have complete liberty, well, then there's a loss of security. Absolute security, if we locked every single person up in this country, put them in a little cage, kept them in that cage, there'd be no crime. You can't go rob somebody if you're already in a cage. You can't be robbed if you're in a cage. Hey, great, we're secure. So you can see, at the extremes, there's always a trade-off there. And even in, more realistic scenarios, there's still that trade-off. Should we be able to drive from point A to point B without going through random checkpoints, getting out of our cars and being searched without any, suspicion of a crime? Well, doing that would probably keep more, illegal, contraband of whatever type off of our streets, but it encroaches certainly upon our liberty. There's that balance, that tension. Same thing with, majority rule. Well, we like the idea of majority rule, but we don't want 50% plus one of the people to trample all over the rights of everyone else. You could have a situation where majority rule, 55% of the people in this country voted to take all of the property and possessions away from the other 45% of the people. Cool, now we get all your stuff. Well, again, there's a tension there. It's not ideal. Economic freedom versus equal opportunity. The more that, differences in wealth, for example, are allowed to carry over from generation to generation, or are, not being redistributed among people, then the less equal of a playing field you have among those who might want to get in on the economic game. And we'll touch on that a little bit with the survey and with a number of the participation assignments that we're going to be doing throughout this semester. And I'm not saying there's a clear answer. There is no clear answer on how to resolve these tensions. I'm merely noting that we should be aware these tensions are there. So while we all have generally agreed upon goals in our game of American government, those goals are not perfectly compatible with one another. And that's where differences can arise. Beyond those broad values, we do have specific interests that come into play too. Some of it could be blatant self-interest. Hey, I want to keep as many dollars in my pocket as I can. Great. Maybe I have a little tomato farm. I want subsidies for my tomatoes. Well, that's just blatant self-interest, but that's fine. We're allowed as individuals in this country to act on behalf of our self-interest when we're engaging with the government, whether it be voting, writing letters, just voicing our opinion. Great. You also have narrower concepts that might not be purely self-interested, but they're narrower concepts of what societal good means. Maybe it's clean air or clean water, having a basic minimum standard of living, having certain health care as an option, having public education, having streets that are free from roving gangs of marauders who set fire to villages, whatever the case might be. So these are just goals generally. And, they come into conflict with one another. What about the players? Well, the players in this game are basically private individuals. You also have elected officials or candidates for office. Government institutions themselves are, in a sense, a separate type of player. Because Congress, when we talk about Congress, isn't just the collection of people who happen to have been elected to Congress. Congress as a group plays a very distinct, defined role in American government. And therefore, Congress as a collective entity is almost a separate player from the group of individual congressmen. Interest groups, obviously, a big part of our game of American government. And the focus today is going to be on private individuals. But remember, private individuals are the ones who select elected officials. They're the ones who actually become elected officials by running and holding office. And they are the ones who ultimately form interest groups to protect or advocate for shared goals among those individuals as private citizens. We're also a diverse bunch, and I want you to take a look at the charts in the Blackboard folder to get a better idea of this. But our nation is by no means homogeneous. We have a great array of racial disparity. We have differences in ethnicity or national origin. Obviously, differences between sexes or genders. Differences in our religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs or the intensity of our religious beliefs. And differences in economic well-being. Some of us are very, very wealthy. Some of us are very, very destitute. And then there's an entire range of people in between. And the point with all this is that those differences in our backgrounds, in our identities, if you will, have real effects on the game of American government as we see it played in our nation today. Now, identity politics is a phrase you often hear thrown out in a pejorative sense, as in, you're trying to play one side against another. It's sort of a zero-sum game. Well, if one group loses, then another group wins. And it's this battle. And that's become increasingly common as our politics have become more polarized along the demographic lines that I've just laid out, those cleavages. But our self-described identity is an important component of who we are. It reflects our experiences, our backgrounds. In many cases, a shared identity can be a reflection of shared normative values that you've been taught in your community, whether it's somewhere in rural Montana or somewhere in the suburbs of Chicago, whatever the case might be. And I don't want to suggest that identity determines our outlook. That is absolutely not the case. But there is a correlation between identity and goals and beliefs. And that correlation is not surprising if you think about the fact that identity, self-described identity, in some way reflects a shared experience. Well, people with a common experience are more likely to have common outlooks on the goals, for example, of American government. And this goes so far as even to venture into people say, well, no, I don't subscribe to any of this identity politics. I'm an American. Well, what's interesting? You do survey research and ask people, how do you self-identify? And they'll answer the question. And then you ask them, how do you feel about certain political issues? Or even more broadly, values or goals, as I might have asked you in that survey. Well, sure enough, people who who self-identify as quote unquote Americans are more likely to have a certain set of political beliefs or value judgments, normative identifications. And so with that, I'll suggest that all of you go through the survey and keep this in mind as we're moving forward in the semester. Because, when you ask yourself, well, why do I feel the way I do? Why do I believe the things I believe? Why do I identify myself how I identify myself? If you start to think about that, sometimes it can be surprising. Maybe you haven't done it before. And beyond that, though, when you do that with yourself, it becomes easier to look at someone else who might identify differently than you, who might have different views than you, but to say, well, now maybe I get a little better idea of where they're coming from. And that will be very helpful as we move throughout the semester. With that, I say thank you, and I hope you enjoy the week.